History is a massive field, and one of the most researched parts of it is the decline of societies. If you have been on the internet long enough, you will eventually come across this statement. Where does this come from? Who came up with it? Is it right? And is the end of America upon us? Stay tuned for the answers to these questions, which will be told right now. Fate of Empires, John Glubb. And no, Glubb's paper has numerous problems, and the other works in the paper, which most people ignore since nobody reads it, is not better. The main part of the fate of empires is determining how long the average empire has lasted. Glubb compiled 11 states throughout history and the dates between their rise and fall. To the average person, these numbers seem compelling, but a closer examination shows numerous holes. We will begin looking at these 8 specifically. We can see major problems just from his depiction of the Achaemenid Empire. Glubb's start date is over 20 years into the reign of Cyrus the Great, and almost a decade after the conquest of Lydia. He never gave us specific reasons why he chose these dates, and this problem will get worse as we go on. The closest event to 538 is the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539. The Achaemenid Empire ends with the death of Darius III in 330, which is acceptable but ignores the later Persian empires. The Parthians, the Sassanids, lasted for almost 5 centuries, and almost 9 centuries combined. We have found multiple problems with his thesis in the second example, but it will get even worse the further we go on. Glubb's next example is Greece, namely Alexander and his successor states of the Diadochi. The problem with this is that there was no Greek empire beyond Alexander's short-lived state. His generals broke up his empire into multiple states with no continuity of governance and constant infighting. Skip ahead for a second. We see that Glubb ends the Roman Empire in 180, stating that the empire after the 5 emperors
survived normally for more than a century at this date, but it did so in constant confusion, rebellions, civil wars, and barbarian invasions.
His end date of 100 BC is also odd. This matches with the decline of the Seleucids, but ignores the Ptolemaic kingdom, which maintained an important role in Mediterranean affairs for 70 years after this date. His lumping together of Alexander's successor states becomes problematic when he gets to the Romans, as Glubb separates them into eras of the Roman Republic and Empire despite the continuity of governance and territory. This problematic division becomes even more problematic once you take into consideration his inclusion of the Arab Empire. This is a combination of the Rashidid, Umayyad, and a part of the Abbasid Caliphates. These 3 states had the same continuity of governance and territory as the Romans, but are lumped together rather than separated. The final 3 examples all suffer from the same problem. Their start and end dates seem like they have been chosen randomly out of a hat rather than from a serious scholarly examination. The Ottomans started relatively close to their historical foundation, but they are still rather small at this point. His end date of 1570 is a bigger problem. The major event for the Ottomans in that year was the beginning of their successful conquest of Cyprus from Venice. Most historians instead placed the beginning of the centuries-long decline of the Ottomans in 1683, but that would bring Glubb's lifespan of the Ottomans to 363 years. The Ottomans' decline also lasted until the eventual end after World War I, but is still a significant force in geopolitics despite its later status as the sick man of Europe. His dates for Spain and the United Kingdom are egregious. Spain begins in 1500, 8 years after its completion of the Reconquista and the voyage of Columbus. His end date of 1750 is completely ridiculous, as the Spanish would retain the majority of the American colonies until 1820, despite Glubb's claim that the Spanish Empire was
terminated only by the loss of its colonies
by his 1750s date. Also, it brings back the division of the Roman Empire and Republic. Why didn't he choose to end it with the division of the Habsburg Empire? in 1556. At least that would have been a major shift in governance and territorial nature of the state. Britain started in 1700, a date of non-historical significance for the British state, as the Act of Union would not occur for 7 years, and the union of the Scottish and English crowns occurred in 1603. His selection of 1950 as its end date is also odd. Historical census for the end of the British Empire, leading the role in the world affairs, was the Suez Crisis of 1956. But even then, they retained their African colonies until the 1960s and Hong Kong until 1997. These dates seem nonsensical, but they become clear once you look at how long these three lasted, exactly 250 years. He makes evidence conform to his biased conclusion. A final note before we discuss the Romans. Glubb lists is heavily Eurocentric, with 6 of the 11 states being European, and the remainder being from the Near East. China and India are completely ignored. The Han, the Ming, and the Qin dynasties outlasted his 250-year average, alongside with many other Asian and African empires. The Roman state was one of the most important in Western history. From kingdom to republic to empire, the legacy of Rome shall never leave us. It oversaw the transition from the city-state of antiquity to the vast empire that ruled the Mediterranean and lived on for the medieval era. This state has been the center of historical study and attraction for the countless people who love it. Great arguments have been made over when it ended with it, varying from Odoacer's overthrow of Romulus to its last Latin-speaking emperor, to the Fourth Crusade, to the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, and others argue about who is the heir, who is the third Rome. But all these people can agree on one thing: Rome didn't end in 180, and it didn't start in 260. Glubb's selection of 260 as the start date for the Republic is odd. Shortly after the First Punic War, the only relevant event that can be determined is the construction of a large fleet. His date also leaves out many important events of the early Republic. Although Rome was not the great state it would be in following centuries after the Samnite Wars, it was still far bigger than the Ottoman Beyliks. The Pyrrhic Wars, one of the most famous early Roman wars, was also left out. Another great problem is his division of the Romans into the Republic and Empire. Although the Roman Senate was greatly weakened by the emperors, it still continued to meet until 600, and Augustus, as any listener of the history of Rome would know, took great pains to establish continuity of governance. The most glaring inaccuracy is his ending of the empire in 180. His justification is this quote, "But it completely fails to understand Roman history. Should not the Republic have ended with the social wars or the civil wars of Sulla and Marius, Caesar and Pompey, or Octavian and Antony?" And the imperial era was no stranger to rebellion, as these usurpers testify for. The reign of Marcus Aurelius also had many of these qualities. His general, Avidius Cassius, conducted a major uprising in the east. The empire was in the middle of the Antonine Plague, and he spent most of his reign fighting the Marcomanni Wars. Glubb's premature ending of the Roman Empire removes some of the most important figures in its history. Diocletian, Constantine, Theodosius I, who paved the way for feudalism and Christianity, are left out. Septimius Severus and the Illyrian emperors are also left out. Even though the empire was in decline in the West, the decline is greater than the entire lifespan of the United States. During that time, the Severans were fielding the largest armies in Roman history, and even near the very end of the Western Empire, Majorian was conducting grand military campaigns. Although the Eastern Empire is rebranded as the Byzantines, it is important to remember that they were also calling themselves Roman until the end, and the people within Greece were still referring to themselves as Romans until the 20th century. One of the few mentions of the Byzantines in his paper is to deride them as in this comment. Glubb's paper goes beyond simple averages of imperial lifespan. He attempts to explain some of the factors behind the fall of these states, and his reasonings are equally as poor. One of his main reasonings is an attack against immigration. In this section entitled The Influx of Foreigners, he accuses immigrants, regardless of their assimilation, of having dual loyalties and that they would turn on the empire during its decline. He also condemns immigrants for altering the national spirit, such as the grain dole being an example of the decline of the old Roman sturdiness. The grain dole goes back to the Gracchi brothers, who subsidized grain starting in 123 BC. The dole later became free and would reach a height of serving 300,000 people during the time of Julius Caesar, before stabilizing at around 200,000. Attacks on the grain dole never made any sense, as they ignored the success of these large-scale welfare programs that would not be a match until the modern day. 200,000 figure seems large, but bear in mind that's in a city of Rome that had a population of over 1 million. Opponents of the dole never mention what they would have done to solve the issues of hundreds of thousands of starving people in the heart of the empire. The longevity of dole also renders Glubb's argument mute, as it exists in some form for around 6 centuries. The importance of the dole to the Roman state is best emphasized by this quote.
This duty, Senator, devolves upon the princeps. If it is neglected, the utter ruin of the state will follow.
This comes not from a populist in the vein of the Gracchi brothers, but instead from Emperor Tiberius. Glubb's attack on immigration also rings hollow. One of Rome's greatest strengths was its ability to integrate its former enemies into its society. Even Rome's enemies recognized this, such as Philip V of Macedon writing that,
For that it is the fair thing of all, for the state to go strong, with as many as possible having a part in the state, and for the land to be worked not badly, as is now the case. I believe that not one of you would disagree, and it is also possible to look at the others who make use of similar enrollments of citizens, among whom are the Romans, who receive in the state even slaves, when they have freed them, giving them a share in the magistracies, and in such a way not only have they augmented their own fatherland, but they have also sent out colonies to almost 70 places.
The idea of non-Romans serving in politics was not a radical idea. Lucius Cornelius Bulbus, who was originally from Spain and was of Punic descent, was given citizenship by Pompey for his military service and later became consul in 40 BC. The first naturalized citizen to do so. The known members of the Roman Senate came from these provinces. The administration of the provinces came from far-flung areas. Lucius Verus, whose family originated from Hispania, Tarsallonicus, serving as the proconsul of Africa, Publius Marcianus, who was originally from Cirta, serving as legate in Arabia, Tiberius Candius, originally from Cicada, served as legate of Pannonia Superior. The man who educated Marcus Aurelius, Marcus Frommel, was a senator of Berber origins in Cirta. During the reign of Claudius, there was a debate over whether or not to allow Gauls into the Senate. Tacitus wrote this about those in opposition.
Italy, it was asserted, is not so feeble as to be unable to furnish its own capital with a senate. Once our native-born citizens suffice for peoples of our own kin, and we are by no means dissatisfied with the Rome of the past. To this day we cite examples, which under our old customs the Roman character exhibited as to valor and renown. Is it a small thing that Veneti and Insubres have already burst in the Senate house, unless a mob of foreigners, a troop of captives, so to say, is now forced upon us? What distinctions will be left for the remnants of our noble houses, or for any impoverished senators from Latium? Every place will be crowded with these millionaires, whose ancestors of the second and third generations, at the head of hostile tribes, destroyed our armies with fire and sword, and actually besieged the divine Julius at Alesia. These are recent memories. What if they were to rise up, the remembrance of those who fell in Rome's citadel, and at her altar, by the hand of these some barbarians? Let them enjoy indeed the title of citizens, but let them not vulgarize the distinctions of the Senate and the honors of office.
However, Claudius opposed this and stated,
My ancestors, the most ancient of whom was made at once a citizen and a noble of Rome, encouraged me to govern by the same policy of transferring to this city all conspicuous merit, whenever found. And indeed I know as facts that the Julii came from Alba, the Coranicani from Camerium, the Porci from Tusculum, and not to inquire too minutely into the past, that new members have been brought into the Senate from Etruria and Lucania and the whole of Italy, that Italy itself was at last extended to the Alps, to the end that not only single persons, but entire countries and tribes might be united under our name. We had unshaken peace at home. We prospered in all our foreign relations. In the days when Italy beyond the pole was admitted to share our citizenship, and when, enrolling our ranks in the most vigorous of the provincials, under color of settling our legions throughout the world, we recruited our exalted empire. Are we sorry that the Balbi came to us from Spain, and other men not less illustrious from Narbo and Gaul? Their descendants are still among us, and do not yield to us in patriotism. What was the ruin of Sparta and Athens, but this, that mighty as they were in war, they spared from them at aliens, those whom they had conquered. Our founder, Romulus, on the other hand, was so wise that he fought as enemies and then held as fellow citizens several nations on the very same day. Strangers have reigned over us. That freeman's son should be instructed with public offices is not, as many wrongly think, a sudden innovation, or was a common practice in the old Commonwealth, but it will be sold we have fought with the Senoes. I suppose that the Volsci and Acri never stood in array against us. Our city was taken by the Gauls. Well, we also gave hostages to the instructions, and passed under the yoke of the Samnites. On the whole, if you review all our wars, never has one bit finished in a shorter time than that with the Gauls. Thenceforth, they have preserved an unbroken and loyal peace. United they are now with us by manners, education, and intermarriage. Let them bring us the gold and the wealth rather than enjoy it in its isolation. Everything, senators, which we now held to be the highest antiquity, was once new. Plebeian magistrates came after patrician. Latin magistrates came after plebeian. Magistrates of other Italian peoples after Latin. This practice too will establish itself, and what we are this day justified by precedents will itself be a precedent.
A final but important point is the importance of these non-Romans in maintaining the late Roman Empire in the West. The crisis of the 3rd century was ended not by the Senate or Italian patricians, but by the Illyrian men who were born of the lowly status, and during the fall of the Western Empire, it was Flavius Aetius and Stilicho who maintained it for so long despite the attacks on their barbarian heritage. Many people inaccurately claim that the resettlement of barbarians on the Roman lands led to the fall of the empire, but the policy had been around since the beginning, with Augustus resettling 50,000 Getians and Nero resettling over 100,000 Transdanubians. It was not the resettlement of barbarians that led to the empire's decline. Instead, it was how they resettled the barbarians and how they were treated. The Goths, having fled the Huns, were brought into the empire only to be then forced to sell their children for dog's meat. It is only logical that this situation produced the Gothic Wars and the disastrous Battle of Adrianople.
Soon, famine and want came upon them, as often happens to a people not yet well settled in a country. The princes and their leaders who ruled them in place of kings, that is Fritigern, Alethius, and Saphrac, began to lament the plight of their army, and begged Lupicinus and Maximus, the Roman commanders, to open a market. But to what will not the fierce lust for gold compel men to assent? The generals, swayed by avarice, sold them at a high price not only the flesh of sheep and oxen, but even the carcasses of dogs and unclean animals, so that a slave would be bartered for a loaf of bread or 10 pounds of meat. When their goods and shadow fell, the greedy trader demanded their sons in return for the necessities of life, and the parents consented even to this, in order to provide for the safety of their children, arguing that it was better to lose liberty than life, and indeed it is better than one be sold, if he will be mercifully fed, than that he should be kept free only to die.
One of the greatest failings of the late Romans was their refusal to integrate and accept the barbarians. What could have happened if Flavius Aetius and Silico were emperors rather than generals? Or if the Goths had been brought into the empire instead of made its enemies? It is important to remember that Zeno, the emperor in the east in 476, was once a chieftain of the unhellenized Isaurian barbarians. There is also a statement that stands out to me because of how misinformed it is about American history.
In Baghdad, in the golden days of Harun al-Rashid, Arabs were a minority in the imperial capital. Istanbul, in the great days of Ottoman rule, was peopled by inhabitants remarkably few of whom were descendants of the Turkish conquerors. In New York, descendants of the Pilgrim Fathers are few and far between.
Those who are familiar with New York history would know that it was the Dutch, not the Pilgrims, that founded New Amsterdam. Before it was conquered by the British, New York City is also well known for its multi-ethnic immigrant population that goes back centuries. In fact, in 1850, almost half the population was foreign-born. Meanwhile, in 1980, 2 years after Glubb wrote this paper, it was 25%. At the national level, percentage of American population that was immigrants was at an all-time low during the height of its power in the mid-20th century, and was below 5% at the time of Glubb's writing this. Glubb also condemned the frivolous nature of people in a declining empire. He specifically condemns gladiatorial games and chariot racing of the Romans, as he states this.
The heroes of declining nations are always the same, the athlete, the singer, or the actor. The word celebrity today is used to designate a comedian or a football player, not a statesman, or general, or a literary genius.
This notion of hedonism and gluttony being part of an imperial decline is consistently trodden out, but is completely wrong. According to the legend, the first chariot game held by the Romans was organized by Romulus, and the giant Cirrus Maximus was constructed in 174 BC. The first recorded gladiatorial death match was in 264 BC. Considering the great love and dedication to this excess, you could only assume the last days of the Roman Empire were filled with death matches. You would be wrong, of course. Constantine attempted to ban gladiatorial combat, and they were ended by Honorius after the martyrdom of the Saint Telemachus a century later. And I hope that from all of this, you get the idea that America's not going to be going anywhere anytime soon because of its age. Empires rise and empires fall, but there is no set time.